when I talk in classes and when we do training for local governments in 2010 for LUCA, one of the questions was always, well, what's so confidential about addresses? You know, you can go out on the street and find addresses. You can go into phone books. You can go find addresses any number of places. When it's in the Census Bureau's hands, it's no longer public. And every piece of information that is provided in LUCA is covered under Title 13. Title 13 simply requires that the Census Bureau protect confidential data, and that includes addresses. Yes, we all know that 123 Main Street is there, but if the Census Bureau tells you that 123 Main Street is there, you can't tell anybody else that you learned it from the census. It requires everybody who touches this information to abide by their confidentiality and security guidelines. That means anyone, if you're using paper products, anybody who has access to those paper products and lists. If you're on a computer network, anybody that has access to that network has to sign off on the confidentiality and security guidelines. In New York in 2010, we performed a statewide review in our office, and we simply solved that by having a couple of dedicated computers that were not connected to our agency network, so that the only people that had access to them were those who were directly involved with the review process. Those computers were in a separate room, which was lockable. So you need to protect access to your systems, access to your computers, and access to all of the Title 13 data. Census Bureau it's zero tolerance. There's no margin for maybe having it secure and maybe not having it secure. You have to agree to this. And for the Census Bureau, they're subject to, $250,000 fine and 5 years in prison. So you don't want to mess with that. Protect the data. So you have to meet all of those security requirements, and I'm pretty much reiterating what was on the earlier slide. Make sure that you can agree to those requirements. What's new for 2020? Streamlined participation. They're trying to make it a little easier for you in terms of selecting the type of data that you will receive from the Census Bureau, the address data, digital formats that are easier to work with in standard spreadsheet software, latitude and longitude. GIS, even since 2010, has exploded and been available to many more local governments, particularly at the county level. And so those coordinate points for addresses are now available to you. What we're talking about here is residential address information, and if the Census Bureau doesn't have it and you do, that is documentation of the existence of an address, and you are able to submit that information. One of the real sticky points here in the LUCA process in addressing is multi-unit structures, and you need to be very clear that multi-unit structures, it's not, what you want is not just the address for the building. Each of those individual units within it has to be identified. Apartment 1, 2, first floor, second floor, basement, attic. However you can identify those units, it needs to be part of your LUCA submission. And the Census Bureau allows you to identify those substructure units. I'm gonna pause right now and ask the operator to come on and allow an opportunity for questions and unmute your lines in case anybody has questions.
Hi, my name is Kelly. I'm from the city of Caliente, a tiny little place in Nevada. Please be real patient with me. This is completely new to me. I am a little concerned as to how the process works when the mail system, USPS, only delivers with a P.O. box in our community. Okay.
I will speak from the experience that I've had in prior censuses, because we have a lot of communities in New York that are the same way. I live in one. A lot of people get their mail at the post office and do not have house-to-house delivery. it's necessary for the Census Bureau to reconcile that post office box delivery with the actual physical location of the unit. So in the case of LUCA, this just occurred to me, this might be an opportunity. If you have an XY coordinate for the physical location of that unit that can be tied to the LUCA submission, that would be advantageous. In the materials, I think I've got a slide coming up in the example of paper materials where you can identify the type of address, whether it's a location address, a mailing address, or both. And in the case of those post office boxes, you would want to identify that. But you raise an important consideration for a lot of rural, small areas.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So tools that are available. One of the difficult things about LUCA is that it is not easy. It does take resources, but there are some things that you can do to help out in that process and try and make it as efficient as possible. One of them is this early address count list. This is available to you right now. It has been for some months. What the Census Bureau prepares, and we started this in New York some years ago, because New York provided the Census Bureau with a substantial upgrade to our geography. And one of the things that we asked to have come back was a count of master address file addresses at the block level. That's now available for everybody. So you can go onto the Bureau's website and download the count file and use that to do some targeting. They have an updated geocoding tool. Again, you can do that online at the Census Bureau. If you have significant GIS capability already, you probably don't need this. But for those smaller, medium-sized places, the Census Bureau's geocoding tool can be quite beneficial because, again, it's that physical location of the address that is critical. It has to be placed in a census block. Everybody has to have a census block. The GUPS software, Geographic Update Partnership software, Census Bureau has developed this tool for people who don't have GIS, but it's essentially a GIS-type interface. We're hoping that the LUCA component of GUPS becomes available soon because it's necessary to do some training on that, but it is another tool that would be available to you. You also have a number of options for participation. GUPS is, as I mentioned, a software application. You do not need GIS, and it includes all of your address and geographic mapping base for conducting the LUCA program. You can get data in digital forms that is basically readable in pretty much any spreadsheet database software, generic files that can be imported for analysis on the computer. And for smaller local governments, you can still do paper listing and paper maps, and we'll talk about those. Schedule, we're pretty well on here, and it's coming down to the wire. Again, participation, December 15th is the deadline. If you don't get that highest elected official signing the lettering to the Census Bureau by the 15th, you will not participate in LUCA, no exceptions. The actual address review period is 120 days, beginning when you receive the data in February. So whenever your 120 days puts you in April, that will conclude the LUCA, your review opportunity. And again, 120 days is a hard deadline. You need to get it submitted within that period. Census Bureau gets an awful lot of data that they have to process and try and understand, and they will deliver feedback to you in that late 2019 period. And there will be an appeal process. The structure of that and guidelines, I'm sure, will be a Federal Register notice in the future. To my knowledge, it has not been finalized yet. So what do you need to do now? Get your highest elected officials to register. You're on a training workshop. There are a number of them that have been recorded, and as Jennifer mentioned earlier, another one coming up in January. Keep up with those. Most important right now, it comes down to your local address data. What information at a state, county, or local level do you have that has address information that can be used to verify the master address file, add to it, or correct it? One of the purposes of doing this now is to target your efforts. You will be able to go into the master address file, and there will be blocks where Census has done a marvelous job, and you don't really need to worry about them. There will be blocks where you can identify more addresses than the Census Bureau has, and there will be blocks where you identify fewer addresses than the Census Bureau has. That knowledge is how you prioritize your work. 120 days goes pretty fast. If you have a prioritization of those most significant block errors that you need to resolve, now is the time to do that so that you can maximize your 120 days. People really only live in two types of living quarters. There's only two classifications. You're either in a household or group quarters. These are, pretty easy to understand in general. Households where people live, independent house, apartment, mobile home, all of these typical types of living quarters that we think of. But there are unusual ones too. What if you're on a river and somebody lives in a houseboat? What if somebody has sold their home and they live in an RV? They can be living quarters and need to be identified. So households can be occupied or vacant. You need to identify both. The Census Bureau needs to get a questionnaire to all types of dwelling units. Let them worry about whether at census time it's occupied or vacant, but they need to have the address. And, residential housing units come in any variety of forms. You look at this unit here, typical duplex kind of unit with two entries. Well, maybe when it was constructed, but what if these doorways now are entry to two apartments, a first-floor apartment and a second-floor apartment? The interior has been converted. Do they have two addresses? So even what you think of as typical residential housing isn't always typical. In Albany here we have a lot of cases around the State University where, these larger old homes have been subdivided for student housing. And I teach students, and some of them will tell me they get their mail together. There's one mailbox, and then they parcel out the mail to the individuals. Census Bureau needs to know that there are multiple units there. So you need to think about how units get added to your housing stock. New construction is a pretty obvious one. And local governments, most local governments in the country, have a permitting process before you build, certificates of occupancy. Those units end up getting addressed. The Postal Service picks them up. Emergency Management picks them up, and those should be captured. There will be a new construction program post-LUCA where you can additionally identify addresses, because what you're identifying now is up through 2017. What about new construction in 2018 and 19? Those units will have to be included. Lots of different types of conversion. Residential house that's converted into multiple units. Non-residential lofts, warehouses that have been converted into residential units. Units that have been rehabbed and converted and are now put back into use. Mobile homes come and go. Rural areas, there are a lot of areas around here where there's cut up through the trees, and you don't know whether there's a mobile home up there or a mansion or what. All of those things need to be identified. And the converse is also true. Units disappear. Units get demolished. The residential unit gets converted to non-residential. Units get abandoned. The mobile homes get relocated. It's a dynamic process. That's one of the things that makes it somewhat difficult, because you have to keep a handle on that. There are some typical sources. There are some typical sources that are used for identification. and this gives you a pretty good list of them. Property tax assessment is probably one of the most frequently used. Emergency management, you keep track of new construction and a whole variety of other address-based files. But the thing to keep in mind is these administrative records, every administrative record is designed for an administrative purpose. It is not necessarily designed to identify all living quarters, and so it's those unusual anomalies that are difficult to find. And this last bullet here becomes important. Sometimes you simply just have to go out into the field and look at what is going on to try and understand the housing situation. There are lots of different types of problem areas: new developments, apartment complexes, illegal and unconventional types of units. There are lots of ways in which housing becomes problematic, and you have to be creative. The easy stuff is just that. That's usually not what you have to focus on. It's the hard, hidden type of units that become a real problem in the LUCA program, those single address units that have been converted into multiple units, non-residential conversions, and the need to have individual addresses that are ultimately geocoded to a block. That block boundary, that block identifier is critical in the LUCA process. Some of you may know Joe Salvo in the New York City Planning Department. Joe Salvo and his colleague Peter Lobo and their staff, they really cut initial ground in LUCA in the 2000 census. New York City always maintained that they were undercounted by 750,000 people, but there was never any data. When the LUCA program came around in 2000, they did their research. They did their field research. And, this example of 4 mailboxes, well, if you look closely here, you'll see that there are lots of different surnames on each of these mailboxes. Do those represent one unit with multiple people of different surnames living together, or do they actually represent multiple units? It's obviously hard to tell. Here's a unit that the Census Bureau had one address. Everybody got their mail at one address. But clearly there are 5 mailboxes. If you look closely, there are 5 doorbells. There are 5 units in here. Census had one address. This one seems pretty identifiable. Well, there's a mail slot down here in a basement apartment, clearly a renovated basement apartment. Does everybody get their mail here at the main mailbox and then the residents parcel it out and deliver it here? These are the difficult ones, and sometimes it's only field research that will identify these types of units. And another problem which goes to the geocoding issue is streets are named oddly. There are lots of different names to identify the same street. My address is 306 County Route 6. I see it often as CTY Route 6, or County Road 6, or CR 6, or Schufelt Road. All of those represent the same address, the same location. So when you geocode addresses, simply knowing that these aliases are important to identify an address is critical. This is where sometimes there's confusion that the computer process can just spit out, all of the addresses that match properly and spit out the ones that don't. Well, all of those ones that it spits out that don't match may simply be naming conventions, and you have to pay attention to that. Group quarters is another completely different residential living situation. College dormitories, prisons, nursing homes, those are all pretty self-explanatory, except that, think of senior communities that have been developed. It isn't just the nursing home that people move into. People may sell their house and they move into an apartment in a senior community. It's a household. They're independent. They come and go as they please. They have their own kitchen and everything. It's an independent unit. But in that same community, as they get older and more frail, they can move into another unit that has some levels of distance, and all the way to nursing care where they have total care. The identification of those units is critical. Small residential care units, they're difficult to find. They're difficult to identify as group quarters versus households and housing units. I'd like to tell people that that's the Census Bureau's responsibility. You need to identify the address. If you know that it's a group quarters, fine, as an indicator for group quarters. If you're not sure, still identify the address. Then the Census Bureau can determine what type of unit and how it should be enumerated. But in either case, it's the address, the location, that you need to be able to provide. You can get into an awful lot of detail with group quarters. I'm not going to go to this site, but use this link. It will go to an ACS technical documentation that gives you group quarters definitions for different types. It's a long list. There are lots of different types of group quarters, and you should become familiar with how they're identified so that you can address them. And they aren't always so straightforward. These are two shots from the State University here in Albany. This is a residential dormitory tower, pretty easy to identify. These are new student housing quarters that are really apartments on campus. They are non-institutional, and the question is, should these be classified as a group quarters or as households? If you have individual designators for on-campus addresses, designate them as a household. Chances are that that's what they are as apartments. But if not, make sure that it is identified and the address is keyed as group quarters. That forces the Census Bureau to go in and find out what exactly is there. Nursing facilities, prisons, pretty straightforward. These are units where people are under the authorized care and supervision of some authority, generally a state or health authority, and those are the easiest ones. Except, for those of you who have been around for a long time, remember back in 2000 when the Census Bureau geographically miscoded large prison facilities. We had a number of facilities in New York, 3,000 inmate facilities that were geocoded to the wrong municipality. That creates havoc in the data process. So don't ignore these types of units. And again, some of them just simply may be hard. This one says halfway house. So maybe, chances are it is, maybe not. This one, is this an apartment or is it a community residence, a small unit residential facility? Hard to tell. That's where field research can come to play. Okay, that's enough listening to me for a little bit now. I guess we should check and see if there are questions. Otherwise, I'm going to turn it over to Dale Miller to talk about his work.
Hi, Ryan Kammer here from the city of Mesquite, Nevada. Our town, we have a lot of people that come in, live maybe 3 months or 9 months out of the year during the winter time. How do we handle that? Do we have to find out if they're residents of the state, or how do you have any recommendations for people that have a house in, a household, but they might live 3/4 of the time in our city?
I'll give you two answers to that. The technical answer is you don't worry about that. You worry about the address. And the address, so we've got a lot of snowbirds too, and probably some of them are retreating to your places in Nevada.
Probably.
Yeah. What you need to do is make sure that the address is captured. And it then becomes pretty much up to the Census Bureau and the individual. Keep in mind that residence is pretty much self-identification. So if that individual responds to that, is at that address at census time and responds that is their usual place of residence, that is where they would be picked up. The flip side is if that person responds that their usual place of residence is New York, then that would be picked up as a vacant housing unit, and the people would be reconciled back to New York. So the important thing is that both addresses are somewhere in the master address file. Now, my second piece of the answer to that is very New York-centric. And when we did training, we would always try and encourage groups that knew of people who were snowbirds to remember that New York was their home. I don't care if they spend 9 months in Florida. If New York is their home, I want them counted in New York. And so, again, I'm sure the Census Bureau doesn't like to hear me say that, but it points out that it's really the self-identification of the individual. Your role in LUCA is to make sure the address is there.
Perfect. Great. Thank you.